break the bad and pass on the good.
One of the big mistakes parents make is they don't allow their kids to fail.
Darth Vader having some redeemable qualities. It's good to laugh at yourself.
I need to prepare them to be adults in the world without me.
Sometimes the best thing you can do for your kids is to work on your relationship with your partner.
I am here with my good friend and one of my favorite dads. Paul, will you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Tony. Hi, my name is Paul Crawford. I'm a great dad, and I got some wisdom to share.
Yeah, you do. And you have unique wisdom to share because you've gotten two chances at raising kids, and now you're a granddad. So you have a lot of perspective to share on it. So let's just start with just tell me about your kids, where they came from and how they raised and all your experience about it. So just set it all up.
When I was kind of doing the math last night, I'm 61. I had my first kid when I was 29. So more than half of my life at this point, I've been raising a kid at home. I have 4 kids. My oldest will be 32 here in a couple of weeks, my daughter, followed by 3 boys, the youngest of which is 16. So got quite a span. Started raising Megan, was married young and we got immediately pregnant. So my daughter was born in 1993. She was born before we were even celebrated our first anniversary. I was both a husband and a dad in the same year, which came with its series of challenges. And I was in grad school at the time and, some pressures there. And so trying to juggle all that was challenging. So my daughter, Megan, was raising her while I was a grad student with my wife. About 2 years later, we had a son, Bryce. He's now 29.
He's the age you were when Megan was born.
And he's thinking about becoming a husband at the same age and looking to become, I think interested in being a dad too. So yeah, there's a lot of, my daughter was married when she was about 30.
Mhm.
So yeah, there's a lot of repetition there a little bit. So my first marriage didn't work out. We were married about 7 years. So my kids were 6 and 4 when we split up. And I remained an active dad in their lives, lived in the same town with them, had a fair bit of time with them through early teens. And then, my daughter, when she was 12 or 13 or so, made some choices and it was just harder for her to be divided between 2 households. So, we weren't estranged, but there was definitely some distancing of our relationship in her sort of early teens. My son was still pretty active in my house, but in his early teens as well, and he had some challenges in his life. Wound up kind of making a choice to stay with his mom more full time, so there was some distancing, but in the way that I think father-son relationships often work. He came back to me in kind of a big way when he was 17. He facilitated by his mom kicking him out of his house. He came to my house. I picked up this 17-year-old in the last year of his high school in November.
And so what? How long had that been since you had lived in the same house? Like 10 years?
No, it hadn't been that long, but it had been probably 3 or 4,
Okay.
where,
Yeah.
kind of his high school years, he had just set up shop with his mom. We saw each other, but not in a super
Right.
regular
But
way.
a 17-year-old young man is a very different person than a 13-year-old. Yeah.
Very different. Not tracking a lot of what was going on in his life. There were definitely some surprises there that had to be worked out.
Mm-hmm.
So he was wrestling with a lot, as all of us are tending to do in our last years of high school on the eve of sort of semi-formally launching into the world. So we had a lot of conflict in his last year, and he had a lot of issues going on, and I did actually too.
Like, what was the nature of the conflict? I mean, there's a lot of like teenager, parent conflict, but what was the nature of yours?
Well, he was a kid who, as I've come to understand, was wrestling with kind of his place in his friendship circles. I think as objectively as possible, he didn't have a lot of great friends in his life and was, dealing with some pain associated with those loss of friendships. Some of his friends were, younger and not not as mature as they should have been, and there was some, there were some substances involved, and we're just kind of running in some bad circles. And I think he was
Mhm.
just in a lot of pain trying to find his place in the world. So that showed up in our house, and at that time, at some point we'll circle back and tell the rest of the children's story. But I had two young kids in my house, a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old in my house at the same time too,
Mhm.
and a second marriage, and a wife who had good motherly instincts around protecting her younger kids from some of the stuff that was swirling around my older son.
Yeah.
There was a fair bit of conflict, and we were trying to get him to behave in ways that we wanted him to behave, particularly in the presence of these other kids. And he was rebelling. There was a clash of what he was doing and what we thought was acceptable to do. I can acknowledge as well, my control tendencies were really, pushing hard against a 17-year-old who didn't want to be controlled.
Right.
There was a lot of disagreements and emotional interactions that, were not pleasant for anybody involved.
Right.
I can look back on it now. We got him graduated from high school. We got him into a better environment after high school, but he had a lot of stuff to work out, as did I,
Yeah.
as I would later come to learn. And yeah, just had a 2.5 hour conversation with him yesterday about a lot of the things that he's dealing with in life, and we've repaired a lot of our relationship. It feels a lot better, but there was some painful periods in that time frame. At some point, the advice is going to be there's going to be some rough seasons sometimes in relationships, and
Yeah.
that doesn't mean it's always going to be that way. There is another side to some of these. So in this case, that's both true for both my daughter and my oldest son. We had some tough times and some estrangement in between, but we're in a much better place now and
Yeah.
repaired a lot of that. And I think we enjoy each other's company, and there's another side of it, and I'm glad I'm there with him.
And it's been what, 12 years or so since he was 17, and so yeah, it got rough. And then as it often does, it gets worse before it gets better. And then there's a lot of work to do to repair it. So time is one aspect of it, but what are some of the other approaches or efforts or work that you did to help mend that and stay with it? Like, what did it take over that time?
I can't remember exactly where I got this advice, but I can certainly reflect on my own experience, sort of feeling like this idea definitely resonated with me that, it was Mark Twain or something that had some funny comment about something to the effect of, I couldn't believe how dumb my dad was. And then when I was 25, it was amazing how much he had learned in that, in the ensuing 7 years or something
Yeah,
to that
yeah,
effect.
right,
I
right.
think, I just think, in between 17 and 25, we all, have a chance to sort of hopefully build some independence and a little perspective on what was going on with your parents, have some
Hmm.
ability to sort of think outside of yourself and come to appreciate some of that. And that was true for me for sure. I think at 17, 18, chomping at the bit to get out of my house and sort of look at my parents as kind of restricting me and embarrassing and all those things. I went through college, got out, had a job for a couple of years, and then I was going back to grad school. I had a chance to venture out with them to grad school. We spent a solid week together, and actually just before that, I'd remembered having spent the day with my mom in Pennsylvania, and really like at the end of that day, going, having a huge shift in my perspective of her as somebody more than just wasn't just a parent; she was a person, and she was funny. And yeah, just the switch kind of got flipped in my mid 20s that they become something other than your sort of oppressive, restricting parents. So I think some of that happened for both of my kids, as well as for me. Certainly there was a period, and I'm actually kind of still in it of period of transformation of myself. I've become a big disciple of Carl Jung and his idea, the concept of the shadow, this part of you, this disowned part of yourself that is a very powerful presence if you sort of ignore it and don't address it. I woke up to the some sort of like facing my shadow about 6 years ago, and part of that process of trying to recognize and acknowledge and integrate that part of this dark part and disowned part of myself. I got introduced to a whole different way of being in the world. I got introduced into the concept of, as much as I've run my life with sort of my mind and my body, I was an athlete, and that was a big part of my identity growing up, and even through, most of my adulthood. I got a lot of education, played around in academic circles, very much pride myself in, how much I know. And I built my life around running it through my mind and to a certain extent what my body could do. Those were kind of two ways in which I tended to navigate the world and exert myself in the world. And I got introduced to this concept of, well, there's this part of you called your heart, and sort of how it
You're
can
like,
be a
I have a
compass.
heart? What?
Yeah. Well, yeah, just obviously more than just the physiologic side of it. It's
Yeah.
the sort of that emotional connection and living in these ways that very much contrast with the way the mind sees the world.
And you were always a mind guy.
I'm totally a mind guy.
Engineer, right? Really logical.
Very logical, think my way through this.
When you and I met, man, your relationship with emotions was that's irrelevant or
That's a
it's
weak
a
Well, it's a
problem.
weakness. It's not,
It's a
it's
weak.
more than just irrelevant, it's a weakness. So
Mm.
don't let your emotions get the best of you. Let your mind solve all your problems. I last found this book that just like introduced me to a way of being that I'd never been before. I'm 55, and I've heard this saying as well that the toughest journey a man will ever make is the 18 inches from his head to his heart, and that was very true for me. I came into a different way of being and opening up to letting my heart guide some of the ways in which I would see and experience and move through the world. It profoundly changed me and my relationships, including my kids. And, the concept of apologizing, trying to make amends for, wrongs you've done and the mistakes you make. Certainly as a parent, you're not going to get out of parenting without having made mistakes, hopefully not catastrophic ones. But even if you do, you're going to try to address those things. And I, got some coaching and on how to do that. And so I think part of that repair process with particularly my older kids, I know you're sort of focused on this trying to stop this intergenerational trauma that gets passed down. And I certainly have some of that in my upbringing, and I certainly pass it on to my older kids to some degree. Some of it I stopped, and some of it I didn't.
Hmm.
But taking accountability for that, I took the initiative to try to make those repairs and those amends, and I think my kids appreciated it because that's not the side of me that they knew growing up. I think that I went a long way. I had very deep, heartfelt, heart-to-heart connections with both of them in this effort to sort of own things I know that I did that were wrong and hurt them. They met me with the receptivity to me approaching them in some ways that they'd never seen before. So yeah, there was a lot of healing that happened in a very short period of time with them.
I think it's a big part that fathers screw up is that they screw up because we're all going to screw up, and then they screw up the making amends part. My dad was definitely a like, I'm sorry, but the reason I did this is because it kind of flipped the responsibility away. And so the tendency to want to like protect yourself or, not admit, wrongdoing is like definitely the thing that gets in the way of the reparations. So what was your journey like around how to really make an amend to your kids so that they get it, like they can feel it?
It's not part of the operating system that I was installed in me.
Hmm.
I had a great dad too, but there was not a model in my family system of sort of owning, repairing, and apologizing. Like I just don't think I ever heard "I'm sorry" in my family. It just did, or not in a heartfelt way. Sometimes it would be thrown out in a pathetic, victimy way, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." That was the model of how you apologized, if at all. Most of the time, it was just completely not. There was a passive aggressive response. So I didn't have a model of apologizing and making amends. How did I get there? Well, it didn't come easy because I didn't have a model to work with some sort of vulnerable disclosure here. I went through the the 12-step model of there's a part where you find your character defects, you basically admit to them, you seek some guidance on how to live differently, and then you go through the process of trying to identify and make amends with all the people that you've harmed. So there's a little bit of a structure there to that. And, I've fully embraced that process and, got some good coaching on how to make an amends. And certainly my kids were on that list. And so with my heart led way of seeing the world, embracing the model of making an amends to the people you've harmed and the coaching I got around it.
What were some of those things that you needed coaching around that you took on that showed up in the making amends that made the difference?
Let's see, a couple of things. Like one was some useful language in how you do it. Some of the language from the amends making process is, you didn't deserve this. Help them realize that you're taking full ownership of the things that you did. Also seeking out their perspective on it. I remembered in making amends with my daughter, I had my list of things that I thought I'd harmed her on, and I'd shared those with her. And there's an effort that's typically involved of like, is there anything else? And she had a couple of other areas that I wasn't aware of as acutely that I think was important for her to, articulate. So she sensed that softness in me and the opportunity and told me of some areas that she had felt harmed that I wasn't sort of hip to. I think all that helped.
Well, that's also just an acknowledgement of you creating the safe space for her to be able to share that because I really, that's a great point because like, there's things that you think you screwed up on that
Yeah.
you're seeking amends. And then there's the just stuff that you're not even present to that maybe even was much smaller, but had a much bigger impact.
Yeah. But it took kind of the first effort of me volunteering, initiating, acknowledging, sharing in a heartfelt way those things that I was aware of for her to, yeah, sense, yeah, that I was receptive to that sort of repair process for her to bring it up. So, yeah, one begat the other, and it became a safe space for her to share those things that she felt harmed by. Having a trusted, experienced person, a sponsor in this case, have some good language and living in a more open-hearted way that wasn't defensive and my ego was less involved and my authoritarian nature wasn't as involved. That all sort of combined to create a healing space for my daughter and my son and our relationship for sure. And I felt better on the other side of all that too, just because I think some of that guilt that's hard to sometimes identify or know is there was lifted in ways that were very healthy for me.
It's a really good example, and kudos to you for doing the work to break the generational trauma. And I say generational trauma without any accusations of like anything our prior generations did wrong. Like every parent is doing the best they can with what they have. And
Yeah,
Gabor Mate says like 90% of trauma that we experience is intergenerational trauma. So
yeah.
we're just carriers. Like it just comes through us and our legacy. And without doing the work, without bringing attention to it, it will just get passed on. Now, I think the goal is obviously like, man, wouldn't it be great if parents did all the work to clear it out before they became parents and not impart it on their kids? But the second best is like, all right, you're imparting it on your kids, but then you're correcting it. Then they actually are witness to you doing the work. And I think somehow that might be even more powerful.
I agree with that. Sort of reflecting on that, is at 90%. There's certainly I can identify some things. There are moments where I'm like, wow, this isn't me. This is something else. And there's definitely some events in my life where I can go, I could totally see in some of my lineage where this may have come from. Not, obviously not being present for all of it, but it living in me and acting out through me. And yeah, maybe sort of stitch two other things to that, to sort of commentary on that. We're all going to make mistakes as parents. And I also take some solace in the idea. I remember hearing this I think they were talking about intergenerational trauma and just sort of like how we deal with it in real world ways. And it was, I mean, I don't want to, use this as too much as an excuse, but and actually I was explaining this to my son yesterday. I was listening to some other, experts talk about the trauma we deal with. And there was this study that was done with people who were early in college or something like that. And how well they were managing college, being out on their own and how they were adapting. And we've all seen some kids that just they get to college and they can't handle it, and other ones thrive. And sort of they were studying like what are the factors that allow people to sort of thrive. And as part of that, they mapped to sort of how much trauma they had had in their lives. What I found sort of interesting in a very significant way for me is they found the kids that did the best had had a little bit of trauma.
Right.
Obviously, if you had a lot of trauma, you had issues, and the kids who didn't have any trauma had issues.
Mm.
There is some resilience, building that goes on if you're titrated in the right amount of trauma, if you will. I mean,
Yeah.
that's not to say that it would sanction anybody inflicting trauma on anybody under any circumstances, but in the same way that a little bit of anxiety can be good for performance, you get a chance to exercise some resilience if you get challenged a little bit. And can you handle it's just, it's the right amount, if you will. And so I tried to sort of fit in that model that nobody's going to escape some trauma.
Right.
Nobody's going to escape some parenting mistakes. And in the best case scenario, yeah, you demonstrate your ability to sort of move through that, or you get challenged
Yeah.
in a way that will help you grow deeper roots and make the tree stronger, right? When the
Yeah.
winds blow.
Right.
So
That makes total sense to me. I was having the imagery of like, when you like cook meat in a sous vide thing, it's like you cook it and it's the exact temperature you're going for. And I was like, there's like a sous vide process of trauma, like just the right amount. But it the resilience you build, the belief you have in yourself that you grow, like your problem solving, all of that is on the other side of having some failures. And so I think big mistakes, I'll just go out and be judgy about it, but like I think one of the big mistakes parents make is they don't allow their kids to fail. Especially recently, like there's a whole wave of parenting, which is what
yeah,
helicopter, snowplow parenting,
yeah,
like where you're really preventing them from having a life experience. And years ago, I heard Louis C.K. do a bit, and he was like, "I'm not raising children; I'm raising adults." And that was one of the things that really impacted me on my parenting. Was like, right,
yeah,
I need to prepare them to be adults in the world without me. And there's so much of opportunities in life to fail. Like you and I coached little league together. Our kids played little league together, and like there's big successes in there, but there's failure, and you learn from the failures. You learn like those are the opportunities, and so it's definitely a balance of how much do you let them fall on their face, but you're always there to help pick them up. And then college, like to your point, is like the last little petri dish of working through it before you're out in the world. It's a little bit of a safety zone.
yeah.
So that's a really good it's a good point of view around kids. And Olivia, suffered from a lot of bullying, all through middle school, and she struggled like and there was like, as a dad, you want to just fucking punch these kids, like you want to make
Yeah,
it stop. And the resilience that it builds and the strength and the confidence that comes from overcoming problems is a huge important thing for kids to experience.
I completely agree. And I saw where one of those questions that you had sort of posed that definitely came up for me is like, where are some traumas that, you've made choices to not pass on? And, a little bit more my history. I grew up in Texas, from a very southern, culturally oriented perspective. And, spanking was sort of part of the way in which you dealt with kids, right? They
Mhm.
misbehave, they get a spanking, and that happened for me at a very young age, and
Do you remember it?
I do remember my very first one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was 4 years old. I
Huh.
remember it well. I might have even been 3, but I remember it well, and there's like a whole bunch of images that are still with me, and I think that, that idea of punishment and, physical harm and a lot of that definitely stuck with me for a long time, and, of course, my dad had that done to him too, so he was passing on, what had happened to him, and I absolutely love my dad. He was a very, very great man himself and was, a product of his culture just like I am of mine,
Mhm.
and didn't have the all the studies and perspectives that have been built since then that's harmful to kids. Yeah, thankfully I didn't that trauma stopped with me. Didn't do that to my kids. So what I did with that was learn that that's it's not a healthy way of dealing with behavior problems. Yeah, that left a pretty big scar in me and just a whole philosophical approach to sort of punishment, physical reactions to situations that you don't like, control, all that stuff. So, but I'm smarter for it, having lived through it. Yeah, that's a generational trauma I hope that I've stopped and my kids won't have to deal with.
You've heard me talk about 7-year cycles a lot. I didn't know that Meg was born so quickly into your first marriage,
Yeah,
which is like your wife is pregnant for the majority of the first year of your marriage.
yep,
Um, the 7-year cycle part, I was like, when I was just thinking about it, Tammy and I, when we started dating, was 95. And then Olivia was born in 2002. So, we had like a full 7 years, obviously like dating, moving in together, getting engaged, getting married. But we had a lot of time with each other as a couple before we became parents.
yeah,
And I think we were really ready. We were ready. We kind of been through that whole first cycle, and our second 7-year cycle then was more about a family. But what was it like to like get married and get pregnant and have a kid so quickly? Did the
yeah.
relationship not get a chance to develop, or what do you think?
I was reflecting a little bit on how much am I willing to acknowledge around the mistakes I made and the lessons I learned in my first marriage without sort of also acknowledging that it took me going through that and all the pain that it caused everybody, self included, to, result in a second marriage that's been 20 coming up on 24 years and 2 other kids and all the beautiful things that came out of that. But to go back to address your question, I want to honor where my life has gone and the people that
Hmm.
have become part of it as a result of the failure of my first one. But for sure, I think just sort of looking back, yeah, it was too much. It was too much to be trying to be a good husband, a couple, we were 2 months in when we got pregnant. There's a lot to work out in those first couple of years of marriage, and we didn't have a chance to do that, and
Yeah.
that showed later. That definitely compromised a lot of our ability to build some stability in our relationship that would serve us well as parents. So yeah, it was hard to stack both of those on top of each other, on top of the fact that I was in the last couple of years of my graduate studies and the pressures that
Yeah.
come with getting writing my dissertation and getting a job at the other end of that. There was a lot of pressure, and
Right.
life has a lot of pressure with it, but kind of was a triple whammy between marriage, having a kid, and trying to finish up studies so that I could go be a responsible husband and father and make money.
Did you have much of a support system?
Well, you know, I've had both sides of the support system, and the one of having familial support was a little bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
We lived fairly close to in my first marriage, we lived fairly close to her parents. In some ways, I think, also now with a little bit of a grandparent perspective, can see the value of having that support. administered in the right way. But it also was, in this particular instance, for the personalities involved, a point of conflict too.
Mhm.
My ex-mother-in-law just recently passed away, so I will be respectful of as be as respectful as I can. You know, we had a lot of differences of opinions, and she had a big personality, and at times it was a conflict between what I thought were my rights as a father and what she thought were her rights as a grandmother. They definitely did not always see eye to eye. So it
Mhm.
created complications, and I also appreciate that she helped us out a lot in taking care of a very young child as you know, my wife and I were both busy, ex-wife and I were both busy at this time too, trying to make a marriage work and all that stuff. So yeah, I think support systems are great, but properly administered, they're really great. And
Mhm.
you know, poorly administered, they can be they can add to the problem. So yeah, that first year was really rough. And to speak again to your 7-year cycle, you know, married, pregnant in the first year, and 7 years later, we're divorced.
Mhm.
So it was a beautiful and a rough 7 years, all wrapped up into one, and
Yeah.
a new chapter opened up at the end of that.
You were a competitive D1 athlete. You played basketball at Texas A&M and very competitive. I mean, that just being able to perform at that level requires a certain discipline, a certain, drive. How did that serve you, and how did that sort of cause things to be harder in becoming a dad, like that mindset?
I recognize I'm super competitive. I like to win, and that applies not just to sports field, but arguments and choices on things we're going to do. And yeah, I'm pretty headstrong. It both served and hindered my ability to be a dad. You know, maybe to just sort of finish painting the picture. You know, after my first marriage dissolved, about a year and a half later, I met a wonderful woman. I wasn't ready to get in a relationship, but that the attraction and the resonance that we created between us was super powerful, and so that didn't last. So about 6 months later, we got married.
You and Christine got married after 6 months of knowing each other?
Yep,
Wow. You move
yep,
quick, bro.
yeah. It was definitely unexpected, but it was what, 7 months maybe. Let's see, met in November of 2001 in an airport, and got married in July of the following year. So yeah, what's that? 8 months, 9 months maybe.
Mhm.
We were married in 2002 and had Aiden in 2005. So I guess we had right at 3 years of a marriage. And then I had Aiden in 2005, and we had Aiden in 2005, and then 4 years later had Reese in 2009. So, you know, as it relates, you know, I'm getting around to answering your question. How did that competitive drive serve me? I had two boys in my second marriage.
And also, Christine is a competitive D1 athlete. So,
Christine also played basketball and was competitive. You know, I think she would, and I would say as well, not to the maniacal degree that I am, but but she's, you know, she's no wallflower. It served a little bit as a hindrance in my first marriage, particularly with young children. That yeah, I was competitive, like to win, and that applied to everything, even as a young dad. You know, it didn't serve my marriage well for sure. Let's say in my second marriage, it served me in that I knew, you know, both, as it turns out, both my boys in my second marriage, you know, are very, very sports focused. It was easy to resonate with me and to get me involved in the things that interested them, which was sports. And I had a lot of insights into how to be successful in that way. And, you know, I shared that with them. So, that, yeah, there was a lot of connection that I still have today with both of my boys. My 20-year-old is now playing in college basketball, and my 16-year-old is, you know, it's pretty much his life is basketball too. So I know that world. I can coach them both in the true performance aspect, but also just the life aspect as it revolves around that. And they're both super competitive too. So we have a lot of common viewpoints in the world.
Mhm.
It served both of them for sure. And my parenting as a dad to be able to connect with them, easily in some of these common experiences and interests and sort of goals and drives in life. My wife would kid me as well that, maybe it interfered a little bit with my ability to be a soft dad. I was still beating them in everything I could for as long as I could. I wouldn't try to take them on the court today, but I could for a long time, and I'd like to exert my, prove myself as still a really good
Hmm.
athlete and particularly basketball player with them. Then wasn't going to let them win at anything, right, for a
Yeah,
long
I
time.
remember the day, because we had a basketball hoop out in front of our house for a long time. I remember the day when Leo legitimately beat me. And I'm not a basketball player, right? So I'm not like you.
Yeah,
But and he loved basketball, and it used to drive him crazy that he couldn't beat me. But there's just, there's something about winning in basketball that's not necessarily about skill. And
yeah.
so like, do you remember like the moment when they overtook you?
I'm not. I'm not sure I remember that. I think it's more me just refusing to engage with them because I fear that's probably what would happen. I mean, I took him on and beat him when I knew I could, and then when I sensed that maybe I couldn't, I'm not sure my ego would let me go there. Um, so, yeah, and actually, in the spirit of this podcast, I wore one of my favorite shirts. This is, it says I got this from my kids on
Oh,
Father's
nice.
Day. Number one dad, and I mean, Darth Vader, right?
That's
Number one
fucking
dad.
great. Yeah.
It's in the advice world or the wisdom that I like to pass along. I know I took things I've taken a lot of things in life very, very seriously to the point, to the extremes, and to the point of it being a problem. And sometimes laughing at yourself is probably a pretty good way of being too, and swallowing your ego. And I did accept this shirt, being a huge fan of Star Wars, and I think the spirit intended, right? The two sides of Darth Vader, both as the dark figure that destroyed and killed and crushed good people, and in the end had some redeemable qualities about him too. That we all have the dark and the light. Number one dad is a joke, of course, for Darth Vader, but I sometimes identify with that, right? You gotta laugh at yourself. So
You gotta
this is
laugh at yourself.
literally this is my preferred shirt for sleeping at night. I love
That's
I
great.
love the message that my kids sent me on Darth Vader having some redeemable qualities. So yeah, it's good. It's good to laugh at yourself. Yeah.
You had the rare chance of like going through having children, raising them, learning what you wanted to be, what you didn't want to be, what you wanted to do, what you didn't want to do, and take those lessons. And then, what specifically did you when Aiden was born, when Reese was growing up, like what did you intentionally do differently? And also I don't really know I don't know your first relationship, but I know that you and Christine, very much in love and excited about starting a family. So what did you bring differently into your second go round?
I think Christina and I had echoing the point a little bit earlier. We had a more solid footing in our relationship than just I couldn't have created in our first one for the reasons that I talked about earlier. So I think we were a little more solid and set in our relationship, and that allowed us to not have as many things to work out in the presence of these now disruptive little creatures, certainly when they're young. So I think operated from just a more grounded sense of my marriage. I think I came to appreciate not so much in my first marriage, and my wife would even argue, for a good part of our second marriage, I didn't appreciate motherhood as much as I should. But
Mm,
I can now look at it with some hindsight and see I have a great reverence both for the institution of marriage and the institution of motherhood.
mm,
I think there are some different roles and responsibilities there, and sometimes I like I like this saying, although in the Me Too era and dealing with the misogyny, I could see how it could get interpreted in maybe some bad ways. But it's like I sometimes say, look, it's not my fault I have testosterone. There is there is some things that go on with me that you of the not testosterone filled variety don't understand.
Right.
Not an excuse making, but it's just sort of recognizing that, yeah, you don't see the world in the same way that I do. But on the flip side of that is I'm not mothering a child and flooded with these hormones of, being a good mother.
Right.
I appreciate now, but now particularly the very sort of Darwinianly rational reasons that a mother is going to protect and care for a child in a very profound way. The mother bear sort of thing is very real. They have a very strong drive to protect their children in,
Mhm.
in the way that I do, but in a sort of different sort of way. So, what did I bring into that raising my second set of family that I learned the first? Well, I think maybe just to build slightly on that idea that a solid relationship is a good place to start with with your partner. I think I learned at sort of in the ashes of my first marriage, for which I was trying to be a very good dad, even while I was had a lot of conflict with my wife, to recognize that sometimes the best thing you can do for your kids is to work on your relationship with your partner. Right?
Mm.
That's a gift to your kids.
Mm.
Right? So if that's driving you, sometimes the best sort of way to help your kids is to work on your relationship with your partner because they will benefit from
Yeah.
a loving relationship in their parents. So I
But that's
think
part, let's
that's
acknowledge that the first 7 years of having kids is pretty hard to find time to work on your relationship because you're just underwater, and it's such a unique set of focuses that you put onto the children, and then they break through out of that 7 years, and then they're less needy, and they're more self-sustaining, and then that's when the opportunity to kind of go like, all right, we really need to shore up our relationship. But that's usually when it's the hardest.
true. And I think that's where I see often, you know, another piece of advice that I would sort of bake in is that support networks are really important in those certainly those early years. That's why I think so many people return to their home or their family or maybe grandparents show up. Because if in the right conditions, and that's I'm certainly trying to embrace that as my own, being a grandparent now. My oldest daughter had kids a little less than 2 years ago. I'm trying to be there for her out of love for the kids, which is an interesting sort of biological impulse that I didn't see coming when I first sort of, got in the company of those kids. Wow, it was really powerful. But also for my daughter and her husband, I can certainly remember the difficulties of that all-consuming. They have twins, right? So, times two of the challenges of, this very needy presence in their lives to give them some breaks so that they can work on their marriage too. So I'm acutely aware of that. So yeah, I think work on your marriage at the same time you're working on being a good parent is another piece that I sort of brought into my second marriage and raising my kids, respecting motherhood, the institution of motherhood, and how differently I think a mother will see the world than sometimes a father, and to work with that rather than find necessarily conflict with it. I guess all these are at least these top of mind ones are all about improving your marriage for the benefit of your children. That's you can't if it becomes all
Yeah.
about the kids, which I think it very much was so in my first marriage, that has the effect of creating some corrosion in the marriage itself.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of a, just sort of byproduct. I didn't have all the pressures of graduate school and, financial challenges that I had my second time around. That definitely served me well. I'm definitely a better parent just out of maturity, financial stability, the experience of raising kids. There's no, sort of more intensive training session than raising kids because you're on all the time, 24/7. In my first marriage and set of child raising efforts, you just get a lot of training, and you're naturally going to learn more apply that your second time around. So that was definitely the case for me. I was smarter. I was more centered, more stable, had a good relationship with my wife. We were thriving in ways that was harder to do in my first marriage. So all that shows up. I think there is some, even as you're taking care of kids and how that's should be driving or should be a part of the sort of prime directive, if you will. Also taking care of yourself so that you can, tend to some of your own needs is a piece of being a better person. And so, yeah, I just had a lot going on in that second time around that was on the positive side as opposed to the sort of more challenging side.
You've heard of like what's the difference between a chicken and a pig and a bacon and egg breakfast?
Now,
The chicken's involved, but the pig is committed.
yeah, I
And I
see
was thinking
that.
about that when you were talking about like what is the difference between a mother and a father? Like in the course of like raising children, in a little bit like there's almost no evidence that the father had anything to do with it. But like the mom, it's 100% the mom. We all know who the mother is, and so it's sort of like in my mind, I'm like, the father is involved, but the mom's committed,
Yeah,
and there's something about that. But then when you were talking about being a grandparent, I thought maybe that's what's so much easier about being a grandparent is like the grandparents involved, but the parents are committed. Like the parents are the ones going to have to deal with the aftermath of everything, and the grandparents like, I'm here for a period of time, and it's like, here's your baby back. When you're also talking about twins, I remember when Leo was born, like two is how is it possible? Like two kids is way more than one kid. It's not
yeah,
just it's like an exponential growth. Like I imagine for Megan like having twins that's way more than having two kids because they're
yeah,
at the exact same time.
yeah.
And
And
so,
there's no rest. No, both they hardly ever go down at the same time, right? So you're just like you're basically dealing with a constant series of challenges. And there's times where they bounce off each other, so some of that energy gets expended between them. But
right.
it definitely creates a unique challenge that those of us who just had one at a time didn't fully appreciate till we had a second one. Presumably in
Yeah.
close proximity to the first. The other thing that I guess I would just point out on the grandparenting side, that was sort of interesting for me, that has given me perspective as a parent that I didn't fully appreciate. Like I kind of alluded to earlier, I've gone through all the phases of, early adulthood where kind of kids kind of annoyed me to a significant degree to becoming a parent and just sort of like, wow, yeah, they don't annoy me in the way that they used to. And I can be, in love with these little creatures that, they start out with, they're very lovable, but they, require a lot of maintenance. But then they grow into personalities and a loving presence. And, you obviously love all that. But then coming back to that, and when I came in as a grandparent, I think, it came on the heels of a lot of this sort of work to better understand myself and these current theories that are around sort of attachment theory and how like your very, very early childhood experiences can really create a lens in which you see and move through the world. And in just sort of appreciating that, how super critical it is that these very, very small, impressionable creatures who are not going to remember the first year of their life, they get imbued with this perspective of whether or not their caregiver is going to be attentive to their needs or not. And that's going to shape how they are going to move through the rest of their life and for sure their relationships. Can you count on somebody to be there for you?
Hmm.
I didn't have that perspective or that education when I was parenting, but I have and appreciate that as a grandparent. So I very much walk into that conscious of making sure these kids feel loved and cared for by me unconditionally, completely unconditionally. And the other sort of surprise for me was just this biological attachment. It felt biological attachment from the very first moment I saw them. They're gonna get more kids. I've seen kids. I know kids. I know how I feel about kids, but I don't know if it would have. It feels like to me if they'd have lined up kids and you didn't know which one was your grandchild, I would know that these two. I immediately just sort of bonded with them. So
Mm,
intergenerational trauma also maybe has some intergenerational attachment sort of corollaries. Deeply, deeply love and am attached to my grandkids, and I think if there's this idea, the so-called grandmother hypothesis, that the reason humans, after sort of a woman passes through her period of not being, capable of bringing kids in the world anymore, in a Darwinian, like, what good do they serve? Well, I do think there is this grandmother hypothesis is they serve a really critical role in helping their kids raise kids. I
mhm.
adopt that from a grandparent perspective as well. I'm there to help my kids learn how to raise kids. And I think as much as all the lessons I've learned and the things that, I did as a parent that I wish I could have done differently, I get another try as a grandparent with all the stability that comes with it to, let's say, finally do it right and to help my kids do it better.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can be a perfect grandparent. I've been pretty good so far, but I'm definitely bringing some wisdom of making sure that those kids feel absolutely unconditionally loved, that they can count on their caregivers when I'm being a caregiver to be there for them so that they can build this strong sense of worth and trust of the world that I think some kids get robbed of because they're, as attachment theory would suggest, they've had a difficult relationship with their caregiver and wind up either avoidant or anxiously attached. So yeah, that's my grandparenting hypothesis is that
Yeah.
you get a chance to sort of build that karma back and teach
Hmm.
the next gen how to do it better.
Paul, this has been great. You've dropped so much wisdom. I want to finish with just really specifically what advice, and as a grandparent, you probably have had a direct opportunity to do this, but what advice would you give to a brand new father?
I'll share my very first moments of being a real live father. I think that moment stuck with me in a really significant way. So I'll start with that and then just try to parlay that into wisdom. Again, mad respect for the mother and the birthing process. I was there when my daughter was delivered, and my wife was obviously dealing with all the trauma of that, physical trauma of that. Baby was born, Megan was born. There's part of the delivery crew that's dealing with the baby. There's part of the delivery crew that's dealing with the mother. And I had the great fortune of at some point sort of being handed Megan. Um, Gets me every time. Yeah. And, up until then, her eyes had been closed, and I was holding her when she opened her eyes for the very first time. And I had just, this really soul to soul connection with this being that I helped bring into the world. And my impulse, I think a very fatherly impulse at that point was to sort of just make this commitment to her that, I would protect her and love her. And, there was, I think, a very natural, fathering response in the moment to, do all the fatherly thing, protect and love, and made that commitment to her. And I think I think there was some intergenerational wisdom that was sort of at play in that moment. I didn't rehearse that. I didn't think about how that would be. It was just a moment of seeing the soul. And her first view of the world was seeing your dad's eyes. So I feel super blessed to have, been powerfully given that moment, and that's always stuck with me. That there'll be some moments of sort of powerful connection with your kid, and to honor the impulse to uh, embrace the intergenerational wisdom that comes with that moment, with the maybe also understanding that there's going to be some stuff you're going to have to work out that you didn't anticipate. And that's being the bad side of that too. And there's intergenerational wisdom that's getting passed down. And there's intergenerational trauma that's getting passed down. And I think as a job as a new father is to anticipate that you're gonna have some bad impulses and you're gonna have some good impulses that you did not see coming. And yeah, try to embrace the good impulses and the wisdom for their intended purpose. And I don't know that I'd say, resistance can sometimes cause problems, but maybe just operate with some awareness that there's going to be some things at play that are going to work through you that you did not see coming, that you do not know how to deal with. And then, give yourself maybe some grace as we all try to deal with the messiness of that lineage of traumas that are coming, and hopefully to the intent of what you're promoting here, that will operate with enough wisdom and love and courage in the moment to stop it when it's going to get there, because you're going to get them. You may not think it, you may not have ever seen it before, but there's some stuff that's going to work. That's going to be trying to work itself out through you and challenge you, and to try to stay as connected to that, your heart and your loving presence as possible, to break the bad and pass on the good.
I don't know that I ever thought about it like that before, but what I just heard you say was that this trauma wants to get worked out. It doesn't want to stay in your family, but that it has to get worked out through you. It's a whole new way of looking at being a parent, being a dad. It's really beautiful. Paul, I am so grateful for the time and your openness and your vulnerability and your wisdom and your sharing so much. I love you, brother. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time and everything you shared.
Tony, thanks for doing this for dads, like you said, or like I think you tried to frame it. Yeah, I wish I'd have had more dads and men in my life that could have, helped me see things that I didn't know how to navigate. So thank you for your contribution to this world. I hope if one man picks this up and becomes a better father for it, that would be, all I could hope for and wish for. So thank you for your
I just
service
got
to
chills
that.
through my body when you said that, because yes, that's all that matters. It's just one. And that's all that
Yeah.
matters.
Yeah. So thank you for your service and efforts here, and hope it does serve some young dad in a way that makes them a better father, and yeah, passes down to the next generation in a positive way. So thank you for
Hmm.
your efforts in this regard. It's been fun. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Until next time. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Dad Manual Podcast. If you liked it, please leave us a rating or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you really liked it, please share it with a dad you love. I'm looking to grow a community of fathers who are ready to change the world, and I need your help to do that. And if you got questions or topics you want me to explore, email them to me at thedadmanual@gmail.com. I would love to answer your questions on our next episode. Until next time, I'm Tony Cooper, and this is the Dad Manual Podcast.